At this moment, the alliance between Trump and Zelensky is coming to the forefront. The world is no longer hiding it. The presidents have indeed shaken hands. The US leader is sending super weapons to Kyiv. NATO gives a standing ovation. Our people did it. Putin is canceling yet another parade. Ukrainian drones have hit a sore spot for the Kremlin. The Russian Federation certainly won't be able to recover now. Ukraine is leading the way. For the first time, Russians were defeated by AI-powered drones. A new reality, now without operators. Total shock. The fuel catastrophe has reached the airports. In Sochi, hundreds of flights are cancelled and thousands of tourists are stranded. Airplanes are now a luxury. And all of this is happening right now. Greetings. I'm Daryna Gutsalo and we're getting started. The US and Ukraine seem to have never shown such close coordination in the war. Americans and Donald Trump himself have changed their view on Ukraine, taking a stance that other G7 leaders consider more realistic. This was openly stated by Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney.
In discussions regarding Ukraine, there's a shift in the US position, which we believe is more realistic given the battlefield situation, the potential outcome of the war, and Russia's defeat.
Furthermore, Carney noted that over the last 36 hours, he held 7 or 8 conversations with US President Donald Trump, during which a wide range of topics were discussed, including Iran, Lebanon, and Ukraine. Amid these statements, there's increasing talk behind the scenes about a possible restructuring of the West's joint strategy regarding the war. And here's another sharp maneuver. The NATO Secretary General made a hopeful statement about supplying Patriot missiles to Ukraine. He emphasized that at the next alliance summit to be held on July 7th and 8th in Turkey, NATO will focus primarily on what Kyiv needs to continue the fight.
I am quite confident that together we will provide you with everything necessary to the extent that Europeans and Americans can help you defend yourselves.
And the main intrigue now is how far will this new realism go? We're following the developments. Ukraine has done it again, cancelling another of Putin's important events. The Russian Ministry of Defense is one step away from a decision that will finally change everything. Putin will indeed cancel the annual naval parade in St. Petersburg, which is traditionally dedicated to Navy Day and takes place on the last Sunday of July. The reason for this decision is cited as a sharp increase in risks due to potential Ukrainian long-range strikes.
Ukrainian long-range strikes at distances of over 1,000 kilometers from the international border continue to demonstrate how Ukraine is bringing Russia's war home, disrupting events that the Kremlin has historically used for reputational and narrative purposes.
In recent months, strikes on St. Petersburg have become increasingly regular. Both military targets and the city's oil infrastructure are coming under fire. The attacks caused a particular stir even during the International Economic Forum in early June, when security risks could no longer be ignored, so there's more to come. No one in the world has ever done this before. Ukrainian drones with artificial intelligence struck Russian positions. As it became known, the system worked completely without operator involvement. The algorithms identified the targets themselves and made the decision to strike. As a result of the special operation, several Russian soldiers and an enemy truck were eliminated.
The test took place 2 years ago. It involved quadcopters programmed to fly to the front line, covering a distance of 3 to 5 kilometers in about 10 minutes, and then switching to Terminator mode, in which the AI model searches for and intercepts targets.
As noted, the operation involving 10 drones was carried out near the cities of Bakhmut and Chasiv Yar as part of the Ukrainian counteroffensive.
Reports from 2023 stated that Ukrainian strike drones equipped with artificial intelligence found and attacked targets without human assistance. But they were used against vehicles, such as tanks, rather than against infantry. At that time, there was no confirmation of any human casualties.
Note that in Ukraine, the use of artificial intelligence in military systems is approached with certain restrictions. In particular, the final decision at the target engagement stage remains entirely with a human. Autonomous actions are not yet allowed at this point. At the same time, artificial intelligence itself is already actively integrated into various processes leading up to this stage. It is used for target recognition, analysis, and tracking as part of various defense systems. Clearly, the new test could mark the start of truly historic processes. It started. Flights are being cancelled en masse in Russia due to problems with aviation fuel. At Sochi airport, over 100 flights were delayed and some were cancelled. The airfield simply can't handle the load and passengers haven't been able to fly out for several days.
Passengers of Flight 6641 said they were supposed to fly from Sochi to Novosibirsk on June 15th. The flight was rescheduled 4 times. After the first long delay on June 16th, passengers were put in a hotel for a few hours but were later returned to the airport. At the same time, the airline's customers had already checked their luggage, so they're forced to wait at the airport. They weren't provided with new hotel accommodations.
Russians can barely contain themselves. Over 2 days, passengers were given several meal vouchers, but the places that accept them ran out of food. What's more, flights are being rescheduled one after another in Yaroslavl without clear explanations or proper coordination.
We have no deadlines, nothing. We're at the Yaroslavl airport, don't think ill of us. I don't know when all this will end. By the way, just a couple of minutes ago, they also turned on
fire official training, this whole alarm thing, and they asked everyone to leave the premises. Can you imagine? This, my friends, is a total mess. It seems Putin definitely won't be able to hide these problems. So, we're following the developments. The Russian offensive is starting to lose momentum, and the initiative is increasingly shifting to the AFU. Despite the Kremlin's claims, there are more counterattacks and reclaimed positions on the front, forcing Russian forces to constantly react instead of plan. At the same time, strikes on the rear, fuel logistics, and military infrastructure are gradually undermining the Russian supply system. Is this really what the end of Moscow looks like? Let's watch. The initiative on the front is relentlessly passing into the hands of the Ukrainian military. According to analysts from the Institute for the Study of War, the Russian army continues to attack in several directions at once, but increasingly faces not a retreat but tough Ukrainian counterattacks. While not long ago the occupiers reported a relentless offensive, now Russian war correspondents are increasingly forced to explain why the front has suddenly started moving in the opposite direction. The most alarming situation for the Russians is unfolding in the Lyman and adjacent directions. There, Ukrainian units are not just holding back the enemy, but methodically pushing them out of positions, reclaiming settlements, and destroying prepared defensive lines. Russian military bloggers already openly admit that the AFU has wedged into certain defensive sectors several kilometers deep, and the prospects of further advancement by Ukrainian forces are causing them increasing nervousness. No less significant events are unfolding in the Borivske and Sloviansk directions. There, the occupiers, who until recently were quick to report their own successes, have suddenly begun to lose control over territories they already considered secured. Ukrainian warriors are reclaiming positions, inflicting losses on the enemy, and forcing them to move reserves to where the Kremlin had no plans to conduct defensive battles. It is particularly symbolic that all this is happening against the backdrop of a much broader Ukrainian campaign. Back in the spring, the defense forces conducted a series of successful counter-offensive actions in the south, where, according to the Ukrainian command and the Institute for the Study of War, hundreds of square kilometers of territory were liberated. At that time, Russia was forced to hastily move reserves and patch holes in its own defense, effectively sacrificing offensive plans to save the situation in certain sectors of the front. It turns out that while Kremlin propaganda continues to talk about strategic superiority, the Russian command is increasingly forced to react to Ukraine's actions rather than the other way around. If the current trend continues in the coming weeks, Russian generals will have to think not about new offensives, but about how to hold on to what they recently considered their indisputable gains. And while in certain sectors of the front, Russian troops are increasingly forced to shift from offensive to defense, the Kremlin's problems are only deepening. Western analysts are pointing to a trend that is becoming increasingly obvious. The pace of the Russian advance is slowing down rapidly, and in some places it has stopped altogether. The reason is simple and at the same time painful for the occupiers. Ukrainian strikes are increasingly hitting not just the symptoms, but the very foundation of the Russian military machine. For years, the Russian army relied on its main advantage, vast stockpiles of ammo, fuel, and a near-constant flow of resources to the front. But when depots turn into fireballs one by one, logistics routes are under constant attack, and transport convoys risk never reaching the front. Even numerical superiority starts to lose its meaning. A rather ironic picture is emerging. While Kremlin propagandists show off new successes on screen, Ukrainian drones are methodically cutting down the very possibility of those successes existing. A side effect of this campaign has been equally painful for Moscow. Russia's air defense system is forced to split its focus between the front, occupied territories, and the deep rear. As a result, more and more strategic sites are coming under fire. Oil depots, defense plants, logistics hubs, and military warehouses have long since stopped feeling untouchable. Every new successful strike triggers a domino effect, creating new problems for the Russian economy, army, and supply system. The commander of the Unmanned Systems Forces, Robert Brovdi, known as Magyar, has repeatedly stressed Russia must feel the real price of war. And it seems this principle is gradually turning into a distinct strategy. The war is increasingly coming to places where it wasn't expected: military plants, fuel bases, transport hubs, and critical infrastructure. And when explosions ring out far from the front lines, explaining to the public that everything is going according to plan becomes harder and harder. The authoritative magazine The Economist states, Ukraine's long-range strike campaign has already become one of the most painful blows to the Russian military and economic machine. While Russia's deep rear was once considered relatively safe, explosions are now more frequently visiting places that felt untouchable just yesterday. With each year, the scale of these attacks only grows, and with them, the panic in Russian government offices. Ukraine is hitting the oil refining industry particularly hard, one of the Kremlin's main sources of income. And it's not just tanks or warehouses being hit, but the most complex technological units, which cost billions to repair and take months to fix. So now Russia is forced to dig deeper into its pockets to patch up new holes after Ukrainian strikes. The consequences are becoming harder to hide, even behind Kremlin statistics. According to analysts, Russia's energy export revenues are falling much faster than expected. There's less money, more war spending, and a mountain of problems. And while Moscow recently tried to sell the world the image of an unshakable fortress, today that fortress looks more like a small house with fires breaking out in several rooms at once and less water to put them out. Only one question remains: will Putin handle this fire, or will he burn alive? Unexpectedly for everyone, Lukashenko has turned against Putin. Statements are coming one after another. The Belarusian dictator has finally broken off the Moscow leash. Frightened, he went on air and sharply changed his rhetoric. Is the course now set for friendship with Kyiv and war with the Kremlin? It's hard to believe this. The Belarusians gave a final warning. A mutiny is about to flare up right under the old man's office. The so-called Magyar effect seems to have been more convincing than ever before. What's really behind Lukashenko's flattering words, and will Putin ever forgive him for them? Let's take a look. Against the backdrop of a lingering war and Kremlin losses, cracks are starting to show within the Union bloc that are hard to hide with unity rhetoric. Belarus is increasingly showing signs of distancing itself from a scenario where it's cast as the next participant in the conflict. And Alexander Lukashenko's statements sound less and less like support for Moscow and more like an attempt to jump out of a rapidly overheating cauldron. A loud signal rang out in Grodno, where Lukashenko effectively and publicly drew a line that Minsk has no intention of crossing. At a time when Russia continues its exhausting war, his words sounded like a defiant refusal to follow Kremlin expectations and a political gesture Moscow could hardly ignore.
Are we supposed to go and fight in Ukraine just because someone else wants us to? What, do we want to end up as ground meat over there? No, we don't want that.
The ground meat phrasing sounds like an emotional breakdown of the diplomatic facade. This is no longer a careful balancing act. It's a direct display of fear of being dragged into a war increasingly seen as a grueling and unpredictable meat grinder. And this is exactly where Minsk's key nerve is exposed: the desire to keep the alliance with Russia but stay off the front lines. The second part of his statement, addressed to several neighboring countries at once, was no less revealing. Lukashenko tried to assure Ukraine, Poland, and Lithuania that Belarus is not seeking escalation and has no plans to fight them. But in the current context, such words sound not like confidence, but like an attempt to preemptively clear himself of suspicion in a possible expansion of the war.
I want the Poles, Lithuanians, and Ukrainians to hear me. We don't want to fight them.
Economist Oleksandr Kirsch suggested that Lukashenko is essentially winking with both eyes at once, as if to say, "Hey, who'll take me? I'm yours forever," while simultaneously sending signals to both Putin and the West.
To Putin, don't demand the impossible from us, you scoundrel. It's not 2022 anymore. So, you fool, come to your senses. To the West. Maybe we shouldn't fight. We're reasonable people, especially me. We're slowly reaching an agreement with Trump, and I want the same with everyone. Why do you even need this Chikanuskaya? It's just not serious.
Essentially, we're seeing the classic survival logic of a weaker ally in the shadow of a prolonged war. The deeper Russia sinks into the conflict, the more obvious the risk becomes for Minsk of being dragged in without any control over the consequences. And today's rhetoric from Lukashenko looks less like supporting an ally and more like an attempt to cautiously but increasingly openly distance himself from him. While there's still some room for maneuver. What's more, the old man is increasingly making overtures to the West. During another speech in Grodno, Lukashenko stated he's ready for negotiations with the West and called for a civilized dialogue in the interests of our peoples. He stressed that Belarus is neither an aggressor nor a party to the war, trying to project an image of a state staying out of the conflict despite its alliance with Russia.
We have no intention of fighting anyone. We only seek friendship. We have no intention of going to war. We want to be peaceful people. We want to live in peace. We will do everything for the sake of peace, because war is a catastrophe.
Against this backdrop, more pragmatic assessments of the security situation are emerging. According to the spokesperson for the State Border Guard Service of Ukraine, no additional Russian units are currently being recorded in Belarus that would indicate the formation of a new strike group. At the same time, according to Ukrainian estimates, Russia continues to pressure Minsk, demanding deeper involvement in the war. Despite the lack of signs of immediate preparation for an offensive, the risks of provocation and destabilization in the northern direction remain. Ukraine, for its part, continues to strengthen its defensive lines and fortify the border, realizing that even Minsk's neutral rhetoric does not guarantee full predictability of the situation. And this is where the key question of this entire political construct arises. Is Lukashenko truly capable of gradually stepping out from under Putin's shadow, balancing between the fear of being drawn into the war and dependence on the Kremlin? Or is this just a temporary rhetorical attempt to buy time in a situation where the room for maneuver is narrowing every day? The answer to this question could determine not only the future of Belarus, but also whether it will become the next episode in a war it is currently trying to keep at a distance. Narrator: what the Kremlin tried to hide has finally come to light. The dictator's fear for his life has intensified to the maximum level. Paranoia is making itself known. The bunker dwellers' world collapsed right before his eyes. They won't be able to invent longevity for Putin after all. Health problems are knocking the dictator off his feet. Ultimately, what will finish Putin off? A host of old illnesses or an inner circle that wouldn't mind pushing him into the abyss? Let's take a look. Narrator: Putin wants to live forever. It seems his biggest fear isn't NATO, nor sanctions, nor even Ukrainian drones. His greatest enemy is time. And while the Russian economy suffocates under the burden of war, the master of the Kremlin himself seems to be waging his own war against old age and death. According to Western media, tens of billions of dollars have already been spent on longevity projects in Russia. Gene therapy, growing human organs in animals, bioprinting living tissues, experiments with cell rejuvenation, it all sounds more like the plot of a sci-fi thriller than a state program for a country at war and facing economic hardship. It seems the Kremlin is more concerned with repairing its own ruler than with the future of its own citizens. Particular attention is drawn to the fact that for years Putin has publicly admired the ideas of almost endless life. He talks about organ replacement, body rejuvenation, and future technologies with such enthusiasm as if he plans to personally test their effectiveness over the next few centuries. And talk of naked ice baths and cryo chambers only adds a touch of desperate struggle against the relentless calendar to this image. However, the more the Kremlin talks about defeating aging, the more questions arise. Critics point out that while there are many loud claims, there are far fewer convincing results. Some even suggest that scientists are simply telling the Russian leader what he wants to hear. After all, when you're over 70 and don't want to let go of power, the prospect of outsmarting death becomes extremely attractive. The irony is that while Putin seeks a recipe for immortality, his appearance is increasingly becoming the subject of new rumors and discussions. Instead of the image of an eternal ruler, the world increasingly sees a man desperately trying to prove to nature that its laws do not apply to him. But history has shown time and again, death can be ignored, delayed, or feared, but no one has ever managed to sign a lifelong contract with it. Talk of Putin's health problems has been circulating for many years. He is regularly attributed with a wide variety of diagnoses, from neurological diseases to oncology. Official Moscow, as always, categorically denies everything. However, videos and photographs repeatedly provide new reasons for discussion. Either Putin is clutching the table too tightly during a meeting, as if it were the last pillar of stability, or he moves so cautiously, as if every step is approved by a separate Kremlin commission. Putin's latest appearance at the parade in Moscow has sparked a new wave of questions. British journalists noted that the Russian dictator looked noticeably exhausted, aged, and unnaturally swollen. Social networks immediately exploded with discussions, and users began to wonder if the parade uniform was hiding increasingly obvious problems of the master of the Kremlin. The Daily Mail notes that this time, even a carefully prepared television image could not completely mask the changes in the Russian leader's appearance. The man who for years was shown as a symbol of strength and control increasingly gives the impression of a politician burdened by the weight of his own decisions. And the longer the war lasts, the harder it is to hide fatigue behind official ceremonies and parade speeches.
A short, elderly man bending under the weight of a burden he can no longer lift. Either Putin himself is afraid, or he is being provoked and intimidated in this way, which leads to his fear and paranoia. He looks lonely and isolated in his security bubble.
A wave of rumors hit the Kremlin after photos of the dictator's hands were leaked online. In the released footage, veins, dry skin, and sharply defined tendons were clearly visible. Online, people immediately began to build theories, and experts and commentators once again spoke about possible health problems of the man who has been trying to look like an eternal ruler for over a quarter of a century.
There is clearly something wrong with Putin's hands. Besides being elbow-deep in blood, the veins on them are also very noticeably swollen.
But this is far from the first episode. Previously, footage from Putin's meeting with Donald Trump also sparked heated discussions when users noticed his unsteady gait. On social media, people joked that the Russian president's legs looked as if they had long wanted to retire before their owner. From time to time, much more serious assumptions surface. Various leaks and unofficial reports have included versions about oncological diseases or Parkinson's disease. There's no proof for these claims, yet rumors take on a life of their own and keep resurfacing in the media space.
I can confirm that he's been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease, but it is progressing. Putin is regularly given potent drugs and pain-killing injections.
Meanwhile, other observers urge not to seek sensations where there may be ordinary age-related changes. After decades in power and endless attempts to maintain the image of an eternal leader, even the most carefully built image is starting to crack. And perhaps this is the main paradox of the whole story. A man who for decades tried to create an image of an all-powerful and irreplaceable ruler today increasingly resembles a man fighting an uphill battle against his own age. Billions for longevity experiments, talk of organ replacement, and dreams of an almost infinite life look like an attempt to outplay humanity's oldest rival, time. But while Kremlin scientists search for a recipe for immortality, the calendar continues to relentlessly turn its pages. And it seems that this very opponent makes Putin much more nervous than sanctions, NATO, or even Ukrainian drones. That's all for our broadcast today. We're continuing right now. Follow the latest events so we can be the first to tell you about them. Don't forget to subscribe. See you!